Oji-Ras lay restless, his mind caught in a twisted cycle of nightmares, phantoms of long-lost acquaintances and rivals jeering at him, decaying wraiths clawing at his memory, dark inspirations seeping into every crevice of his mind. Their voices were insidious, relentless, even insightful, gnawing at the edge of his inspiration. Sleep had become an estranged luxury, driven away by his obsession. The Arcane Forge. It was his magnum opus, the culmination of years spent unraveling forbidden knowledge, a structure imbued with dark and intricate magics, forged from relics bearing curses older than memory. It was his greatest achievement. When Oji awoke, he was drenched in sweat, his breath ragged. The remnants of the nightmare clung to him like a second skin, and with them came an epiphany, stark and brutal. He had been holding back, afraid to cross a line that he now knew he must. To truly ascend, to break free of the limits he had imposed on himself, Oji had to embrace the darkness he had kept at bay for so long. He had to give in to the whispers, to that raw, untempered power that called out to him. With grim determination, Oji pushed himself upright, the room bathed in the dim, flickering light of his forge. His gaze moved to the weapons and tools he had created, each one gleaming with the essence of his craft. To others, they were trophies, unparalleled treasures. But to Oji, they were just the beginning, mere prototypes of what he could achieve. He picked up a blade, the cold metal vibrating with latent energy, and studied its form. He then peers at the arcane forge in the distance, its dark promises threading through his thoughts, feeding his ambition. It was time to move beyond restraint, to embrace the craft in its entirety, both light and dark, to push his creations beyond trophies, beyond anything mortals had ever dared to dream. The fervor inside him grew, his hands steady, his eyes alight with a newfound resolve. Oji would not just create tools, he would forge artifacts of unmatched power, each one carrying a piece of his own soul, shaped by both brilliance and shadow. He would push past the boundaries other artificers feared, past mortality itself, into the abyss of the master plane, where true mastery lay. Zinhera lay surrounded by the remnants of the settlement's archives, mixed with her own research notes scattered around her. A fortress of parchment and ink. The flickering glow of candlelight gave life to the shadows in the room, casting them across her furrowed brow as her eyes darted over the faded texts. She had immersed herself in the study of ancient runes, symbols of power once used to suppress jinn, stories of old passed down by Ayanga herself, tales of terror, of the lullaby jinn that whispered its victims into an endless slumber, haunted Zinhera's thoughts. She traced her fingers over the worn symbols, her mind a storm of focus and frustration, trying to make sense of the fragments. The stories Ayanga had told, the warnings, the symbols, it all had to mean something. She wasn't just reading. She was unraveling a labyrinth, searching for a thread that would lead her to a solution. Hours passed, exhaustion creeping in, but Zinhera refused to relent. And then, there it was, a spark, an epiphany. The runes, the stories, they weren't just about destruction. Ayanga had been exiled for her knowledge of these runes, for their power to bind, to subdue without annihilation. Zinhera's thoughts flashed to Ovaz to how his blessings had managed to calm Ayanga's raging elemental spirit. Perhaps destruction wasn't the only path. Perhaps the jinn could be bound, just as Ayanga had been subdued. Darren Lone Swift's life need not be sacrificed. There was another way. Zinhera bolted upright, her mind racing, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Faces flashed through her thoughts. Willem, Oiji, Ayanga. Ayanga was the key, the one who could truly stand against the Jinn. But she was lost, trapped, and buried within, under a cursed sleep. Zinhera set her jaw, her eyes narrowing with determination. If no one else could reach Ayanga, then she would. She had to. Potions, alchemy. She needed something beyond anything she had ever attempted. A concoction that could place oneself into a deep hypnosis, so that could delve deep into her own psyche and awaken the dormant. The complexity of such a task would have daunted many, but Zinhera didn't hesitate. The risk was immense. But so was the need. Ayanga needed her, and Zinhera would not falter. Time passed in a blur as she researched. The room grew colder, the candles flickering low as she brainstormed on which ingredients to use, scribbling notes and flipping through countless dusty pages. Her eyes burned from the strain. Her hands ached from the endless motions, but still she pressed on. Her vision blurred, and she shook her head to clear it, the exhaustion threatening to pull her under. She knew she needed rest. Every rational thought told her that pushing further would only lead to mistakes, but Zinhera's stubbornness was unyielding. She couldn't stop, not when Ayanga's fate rested in her hands. Not when she was so close. But her body could only take so much. The fatigue she had ignored for hours finally claimed her, her head drooping, her eyelids too heavy to lift. With a final futile effort to stay conscious, Zinhera slumped forward, her head coming to rest against the stack of books. Her breathing slowed, her body surrendering to the demands she had denied it. Sleep took her, despite her determination to fight it off, the candlelight flickering one last time, before the room fell into silence. Samuel Andrews sat hunched over a table in the dim-lit corner of the Golden Bough. Across from him, a cloaked figure spoke in hushed tones, deceptive, evasive, each word carefully chosen to obscure rather than reveal. Samuel's patience wore thin. Days of promised insights into the house of tiny lies had led only to half-truths and empty assurances. Samuel could sense the lie behind his every word. The ruse had gone on long enough, and he was done being toyed with. Frustration flared, and Samuel's fist slammed onto the table. Plates rattled, and the cloaked figure leaned back, an insolent grin spreading across his face as he rose. His eyes glinted with a mocking light, as he leaned in close enough for Samuel to catch the bitter scent of his breath. "You haven't learned your lesson yet." The taunt left his lips, sharp, biting, before he turned to leave, the folds of his cloak sweeping the floor. Samuel tried to stand in reply, but pain shot through his leg like a hot iron. The wound fresh, the bandages strained. He fell back into his seat, biting back a snarl of frustration. He was seething, helpless, forced to watch the man walk away, his laughter echoing in Samuel's ears. Samuel's hand clenched around the edge of the table, knuckles white. He had been so close, and now the lead was slipping away, just like the figure disappearing into the shadows of the Golden Bough. Eden approached, her expression carrying a blend of exasperation and care, as she brought Samuel his crutches. She knelt down, her fingers deftly unraveling the makeshift bandages that covered his leg, her voice like silk wrapped in steel. "Still thou refuseth to rest, Samuel? Dost thou think stubbornness will see thee healed?" Samuel's lips curled into a thin line, his brow furrowed. "Stubbornness is all I've got," he grumbled, pain seeping into his voice. He looked away, frustration palpable. "And I cannot sit idle while the house of tiny lies continues to undermine you. They will push and push until they break you, Eden." A tired smile tugged at Eden's lips, a knowing softness glinting in her gaze as she worked to rewrap the bandage. "They cannot break what is unbent. Thou thinkest they have power here. But the golden bough is more than mere stone and mortar," she said, her tone calm, but resolute. She paused, tightening the bandage just enough for him to feel it, to get the point. "Their influence is not a threat." "Not yet," Samuel hissed, his eyes narrowing. He met her gaze, before remembering she was blindfolded, then gazed at his leg, realizing the healing is come along quite fast. Eden exhaled softly, her voice lowering, taking on a gentler, more intimate edge. "The only threat I see lies within thee, Samuel. Thy own unwillingness to heal. Thou thinkest the world falls apart while thou dost pause. But rest is not weakness. It is a weapon." She smoothed the fresh bandages over his leg. "If thou refuseth to care for thy body, thou art of no use to the fight." Samuel clenched his jaw, anger giving way to reluctant understanding. He shifted his weight. "If I promise to rest, will that ease your worries?" His voice was gruff, conceding. Eden's lips curved into a faint smile. "Aye, that it will," she replied, her hands finishing their work, her touch lingering just a moment longer. "Besides, I have plans of my own. I will not sit idle either." Samuel's head snapped up, a look of incredulity crossing his features. "You mean to investigate them yourself?" She nodded, unwavering. "Aye, but unlike thee, I do not rush headlong with a weakened body. I will act when I am ready, and thou must do the same." A flicker of admiration crossed Samuel's gaze, quickly masked by his characteristic gruffness. "Then I'll be ready when you are," he muttered, accepting the crutches from her. "But don't expect me to sit quietly for long." Eden stood, a hint of amusement tugging at her lips. "I would expect nothing less, Samuel." Willem Toth emerged from the kitchen, bearing plates of an exquisite feast. He had been laboring in the golden bough's heart, honoring his debt to Eden through his craft. The dishes were laden with his alchemical mastery, each ingredient chosen not only for taste, but for the energies it imparted. A roast of shimmering avian critter, tender from an intricate marinade of herbs and imbued oils, accompanied by a side of spiced verdant melon, sautéed in a sauce that glowed faintly with warmth. A crusted loaf, infused with rare seeds, baked to golden perfection and meant to fortify the body, while a small vial of glistening reduction sauce, deep burgundy and shimmering, completed the presentation. This meal was no ordinary fare. It was Willem's craft at its height, meant to nourish not just the body, but the spirit, each bite layered in subtle, revitalizing magic. He placed the plates down, the aroma cutting through the tension, lifting the weary spirits around the table. They ate, the warmth of the meal softening their edges, the alchemical properties working unseen to heal, to bolster. After the meal, Willem slung his travel satchel over his shoulder, gratitude in his eyes as he bowed to Eden, thanking her for her hospitality and the provisions that would aid him on his journey. He was leaving for the Shuddering Peaks, a place veiled in relentless mystery, a rumored domain of treacherous conditions, luring countless rogues and the House of Tiny Lies alike. The Shuddering Peaks, with its jagged cliffs and hostile terrain, were unforgiving. But it was a call Willem could not ignore. There were secrets there. Eden's sharp eyes flickered with concern as she looked at Willem, the warmth of the Golden Bough's hearth contrasting with the chill of what lay beyond the door. Her words were quiet but sincere, her tone carrying both caution and care. Willem, art thou truly ready for this? The peaks hold dangers not meant to be faced lightly, she said, her gaze searching his resolve. Willem met her gaze with calm confidence, his demeanor serene. "I am ready, Eden," he said, his voice even, devoid of bravado but rich with conviction. "My meditations have stilled my mind. I have strengthened my body with nourishment. And your care, Eden. It has restored me in ways I can't repay." His eyes held gratitude as he lifts the climbing equipment, gesturing with it. Eden nodded. She could sense Willem's resolve, yet her instincts made her hesitate. Still, she knew Willem was possibly older than herself, and thus tempered through his trials. She walked with him to the door, each step weighted with the intention of a protector. At the threshold she paused, her senses keen, eyes tracing his features, ears listening for hesitation, her nostrils picking up the scent of lingering trepidation. Yet all she found was assurance. "Safe travels, Willem," she finally said, her voice a blend of warmth and caution. She didn't try to stop him or burden him with worry. She trusted, as she always did, in the resilience of those who walked their own path. Willem nodded, a faint smile on his lips, a smile that spoke of gratitude, trust, and the distance between them. With a final glance at Eden, he turned and stepped into the night, the darkness of the master plane swallowing him whole. Eden lingered at the door, watching until even her keen eye could no longer detect him beyond the void. She drew in a deep breath, centering herself. Turning back to the warmth of her domain, her gaze swept across the Golden Bough, her senses sharpened, keen sight catching the flicker of a candle, the faint scuffling of mice, the tang of cold iron from the hearth. To anyone else, everything was in its right place, but Eden knew the balance was delicate. She was ever vigilant, guarding against unseen threats. For now, all was as it should be, but she knew better than to take such peace for granted. She walks off into the night, unbeknownst to her. A figure lurked in the distance. A shady employee, their eyes narrowed, following her every move with an unsettling intensity. Maxim Mori knelt within the blackened depths, the darkness folding around him like an old lover's embrace. He sought the counsel of the maiden, the very embodiment of his devotion, and spoke in hushed tones of Nazareth's proposition. The death of Oiji Ras, the peculiar, mystic whose fate now rested in her ethereal hands. The maiden regarded him without expression, her inscrutable form blending with the void itself. Without a single utterance, her decree was delivered. No. Maxim bowed his head, accepting her silent verdict with reverence. He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer, seeking her favor and blessing for the trials ahead. Shadows seemed to pulse and grow, wrapping around him, infusing his being with a cold, dark power as she granted her favor. He felt her darkness blanket him, seeping into his very bones, strengthening, fortifying. With newfound resolve, Maxim rose. The shadows peeled away, receding from his form as he stepped forward, the dark veil lifting to reveal the vast, desolate expanse of the master plane. Before him stood the looming arches of the seven-path tunnels, their imposing height casting long shadows across the barren land. Mist curled around their base like spectral fingers, clinging to the stone as though reluctant to let go. Nazareth waited there, his imposing figure framed by the titanic archways, arms crossed, and his gaze as cold and unwavering as the stone itself. Maxim approached with deliberate slowness, his eyes narrowing as he studied the warrior. Nazareth's rigid posture, the way his jaw tightened. This was a man who trusted no one, least of all a sorcerer like Maxim. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, the disdain clear in Nazareth's eyes. "You look as though you've been waiting an eternity, Lord Nazareth," Maxim said, a sly grin tugging at his lips, his voice smooth and mocking. Nazareth's eyes narrowed, his gaze unwavering as he replied, "An eternity in thy company would surely be my undoing, Mori. Be swift with thy words, lest my patience run thin." His voice was laced with irritation, the contempt barely veiled. Maxim chuckled, stepping closer, his tone dropping to something more insidious. "I merely wonder, Nazareth, how much faith thou truly hast in your fellow rogues. Specifically, Oijiraz? After all, he is not without his, complexities. His dealings are questionable at best. Dost thou trust him?" He tilted his head, studying Nazareth with an almost feline curiosity, his eyes glinting with a calculating light. Nazareth did not flinch, his lips curving into a cold, humorless smile. "Dost thou take me for a fool, sorcerer? Thy forked tongue doth betray thy intent," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. He took a step closer, his sheer presence casting a heavy shadow over Maxim. "Thou seekest to sow doubt, to poison my mind with suspicion. But know this, I trust thee far less than I trust Ras." Maxim's smirk wavered for only a heartbeat, his eyes narrowing. "A fool? No, my lord, but even the strongest of men can be blinded by their own arrogance." Nazareth's eyes flashed, and he leaned in, his voice a low growl that reverberated with barely restrained menace. "Mind thy tongue, Mori. I suffer thee not out of camaraderie, but necessity. Betray me, and I shall end thee where thou standest." He paused, his gaze piercing, his tone unyielding as steel. "Remember this, I do not need thee, I merely tolerate thee." Maxim held Nazareth's gaze, his smirk now a thin, ghostly line. "Duly noted, Lord Nazareth, but I assure thee my interests are aligned with thine, for now." His words carried a mocking undertone, a challenge that was unspoken, yet heard clearly in the silence that followed. Nazareth's eyes narrowed further, a flicker of impatience crossing his features. Before the tension could boil over, a figure emerged from the shadows. A cultist, cloaked in darkness, his head bowed in reverence. He approached, kneeling before them both. "News, my lord," the cultist began, his voice a hushed whisper. "The Golden Bough, Eden, has grown wary. Her vigilance is heightened. her senses more attuned. And so we tread carefully. The cultist paused, as though weighing his next words. A group of rogues has already entered the tunnels. A sizable party, not long before thy arrival. Nazareth grunted, his patience wearing thin. He cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing ominously. Enough talk, he snapped, pushing past the kneeling cultist, who scrambled out of his way. We waste time. Follow Mori, before my tolerance for thy kind runs dry. Maxim cast a cold glance at the cultist, his eyes narrowing as he questioned. And what of the rogues? Do any among them bear interest to us? The cultist hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously. I know not, my lord. The rogues move with caution, and Eden. She has made it difficult to peruse the contract enlistment logs. He swallowed, lowering his head. She is all eyes and ears as of late. Maxim sighed, a hint of irritation flashing in his eyes. Very well. Continue thy watch, and do not fail me. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he turned to follow Nazareth into the tunnels. The tunnels yawned before them, dark and endless, the oppressive weight of ancient stone pressing in from all sides. Nazareth led the way, his stride confident, each step echoing faintly in the vast emptiness. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the remnants of past travelers littering their path, corpses twisted, broken, some chewed upon, others drained of life. The deeper they delved, the darker it grew, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water or the distant skittering sound of something unseen. Maxim paused as they came upon a particularly gruesome sight, a corpse, its chest cavity swollen, skulker eggs festering beneath the rotting flesh. His eyes gleamed with dark curiosity, and he knelt beside the body, dark energy pulsing from his fingertips as he laid his hand upon the corpse. The body convulsed, shuddering as it was dragged back from the abyss. Its vacant eyes flickered, life of a sort, returning to them as the rogue spoke, its voice a hollow, rasping whisper. The words were disjointed, fragmented, a tale of horror, of the terrors lurking within the depths of the tunnel, of battles fought and lost. Maxim listened intently, his gaze unwavering, as the dead spoke of those who had come before, of what awaited them deeper within. When the creature had given all it could, Maxim released it, the dark energy dissipating as the corpse crumpled to the ground, its soul swallowed once more by the abyss. He rose, brushing his hands against his cloak, his expression unreadable as he turned to Nazareth. Nazareth watched, his gaze cold, a faint sneer on his lips. "Art thou satisfied, Mori?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Maxim met his gaze, his smirk returning. "For now, Lord Nazareth. Lead on." Without another word, they moved forward, descending further into the tunnels, the darkness growing thicker, the weight of the unknown pressing down upon them. Each step carried them deeper into the heart of the abyss, where terror waited, patient and hungry, ready to swallow them whole. Zinhera occupied the Golden Bough kitchen in the early hours of the morning, her focus sharp as she worked. The alchemical tools and dishes left behind by Willem were arrayed before her, each one carefully selected for its precision. The task at hand required nothing less. She was brewing two of the most complex serums she had ever attempted, one to plunge her into the depths of her own psyche, seeking the dormant presence of Ayanga, her elemental guardian, and another to pull her back to consciousness, hopefully with Ayanga fully awakened. These serums required the perfect balance of rare ingredients, precise timing, and an intricate understanding of alchemical reactions, combined with Zinhera's own healing arts to safely navigate the boundaries between consciousness and oblivion. Hours passed, and the kitchen bore witness to Zinhera's relentless pursuit of perfection. The process was grueling, each iteration demanding exact measurements, the perfect sequence of ingredients, and the delicate infusion of her healing arts. She refined the brew over and over, her frustration mounting each time something went wrong. An imbalance in the potency, a misstep in timing, a reaction too volatile. But she persisted, driven by the necessity of her goal. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the pair of tonics were complete, their shimmering contents a testament to her skill. The kitchen, however, was in disarray, her struggle apparent. Zinhera left the kitchen, her eyes searching for Eden. She found her in the main area of the Golden Bough Tavern, moving efficiently despite the weariness that came from a long night of tending to patrons. Zinhera approached her directly, her demeanor unyielding. "Eden," Zinhera said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise, "I have need of thy assistance." She held up the vials, their significance apparent in her unwavering gaze. Eden paused, her eyes moving from Zinhera's face to the serums. "What is it thou askest of me, Zinhera?" She replied, her voice calm, but tinged with curiosity. Zinhera explained her plan, detailing the risks and the necessity of the procedure. She spoke of Ayanga, of the need to awaken her, of the connection they shared. Eden listened intently, her brow furrowed, as she considered the gravity of what was being asked. When Zinhera finished, Eden took a breath and nodded. "I shall aid thee, as thou askest," Eden said, her eyes meeting Zinhera's, a flicker of concern there, but also trust. Eden began to prepare a room for the procedure, gathering what was needed, but Zinhera intervened, her voice firm. "Nay, Eden, not here. We must needs go somewhere lofty. Ayanga's power, once awakened, may be too great for the confines of this place." Eden studied her for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Then let us make our way to the roof," she said. Together they ascended to the rooftop of the Golden Bough. The cold morning air greeted them, carrying the scent of dew and distant wood smoke. The sky was still cloaked in darkness, with only faint hints of dawn on the horizon. The roof itself was expansive, the stone cool beneath their feet, and the wind swept across the open space. Zinhera turned to Eden, her expression serious. "Remember, thou must give me precisely 2 hours," Zinhera said, her tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "No more, no less. Then administer the second serum." Eden nodded again, her gaze steady. 2 hours it shall be. I shall be ready." Zinhera lay down on the makeshift cot that Eden had set up, her heart steadying as she prepared herself for what lay ahead. She grasped the first vial, the cool glass a grounding presence in her hand. With a final glance at Eden, a silent exchange of trust and determination, her eyes lingering on Eden's reassuring presence, Zinhera felt a surge of resolve. She drank the serum, embracing the darkness that swiftly followed. The effects were swift, a heavy drowsiness pulling at her, her vision darkening until all that remained was the void, her mind already reaching out for Ayanga. Oijira stood within the heart of his arcane laboratory, a place once resplendent with vibrant magical auras, now tainted and twisted with the chill of abysmal energies. Wraiths and specters swirled around him, their malevolent presence subdued and pressed into service under Oiji's iron will. These dark spirits were not his allies. They were tools, bound into the threads of his twisted creations. Bound to his arms were skeletal bangles of his own crafting, hands of creation and war, he called these bangles, each adorned with runes of dark intent. With them, he could summon a pair of spectral hands, an extension of his will, enhancing his ability to manipulate the arcane energies that flowed through his work. The laboratory was littered with his experiments, tools, weapons, each once enchanted to serve a singular purpose, now fused and warped through Oji's relentless experimentation. Every item bore grotesque characteristics, blades with eyes that darted around the room, seeking freedom from its existence, hammers that breathed, their surfaces undulating like a living creature, staves with skeletal fingers that twitched as though grasping for something just out of reach. These creations were strange, unsettling, yet none of them matched the vision Oiji held in his mind. Each was a failure, an incomplete reflection of what he sought. His gaze hardened as he surveyed his surroundings. Failure upon failure, yet he pressed on. The techniques he had gleaned from the artist's shattered mind were promising, but something was missing. Something that could bring his vision into being. Something that would transform these abominations into the tools of power he envisioned. Hours turned into days as Oiji's willpower and intellect were pushed to their limits. He worked tirelessly, the laboratory echoing with the sounds of his labor, the hum of dark magic filling the air. He stared at the grotesque creations before him, half-living, half-inanimate abominations. His hands twitched, and the skeletal bands tightened around his forearms, the spectral hands flickering with energy as he realized what he needed. "I hath erred in my approach," he muttered, his voice a low rasp. "But now, I seeth the way forward." His eyes narrowed, a gleam of determination in them. There was one element he had yet to incorporate, one piece of the puzzle that would complete the alchemy of his dark ambitions. And with that realization, he knew his work was far from over. Willem pushed forward against the relentless winds, his body radiating warmth from the hearty, alchemically enhanced meal he'd consumed, an exquisite stew of vegetables, leaf herbs, and seared beast meat, simmered with a potion of thermal vitality he acquired from the Golden Bough's provisions. The magical dish kept his muscles loose, his blood flowing like molten energy, and his skin emanating heat, despite the frigid cold biting at his surroundings. Each step he took crunched through the layers of snow, his eyes focused on the path ahead. The shuddering peaks loomed ominously above, their harsh beauty indifferent to his presence. He hadn't even reached the mountain's base, and already the conditions were brutal. Willem's skin glowed faintly, the enchantment working to keep him protected, a shield of warmth against the unforgiving chill. As he trudged through the snow, something caught his eye. A frozen hand protruding from a mound of ice and frost. He knelt, brushing the snow away to reveal the frozen remains of a rogue, lost to the mountain's cruel behavior. Willem paused, taking in the sight, a sense of somber reverence settling over him. This place was a graveyard for many, a resting place far from the warmth of the world below, and each frozen form told a story of struggle and resolve. The sight of the rogue's remains stirred something within him, empathy for the lost, and a renewed determination to succeed where others had fallen. He knew what he needed to do. Standing, Willem stretched his hands outward. Fingers splayed as he called upon the lost spirits of the peaks. The air around him shifted, a shimmer in the cold mist, as the displaced souls began to gather, drawn by his invocation. One by one, they appeared, ethereal, translucent figures, each with their own distinct presence. Some bore hollow eyes that spoke of untold despair, while others had features softened by time, their expressions lost in the ethereal veil. Their forms flickered like candle flames in the wind, wavering yet stubbornly present. Willem greeted each spirit with a nod, his tone respectful as he spoke, acknowledging them individually. He listened as they whispered their desires, their voices a chorus of longing that echoed in the cold air. They wanted peace, to be reunited with their remains scattered across the mountainside, their restless energy calling out for closure. Willem understood. Respect for the dead was paramount. He made his promise to assist, a solemn pact between the living and the lost, his words binding him to their cause. The spirits agreed to his cause as well, their gratitude palpable as they surrounded him, their energy intertwining with his own. Willem felt a rush of empowerment, a sense of purpose that transcended his solitary journey. The spirits were more than guides. They were allies, sharing their strength and memories of the mountain's secrets. In return, they lent him their knowledge of the treacherous paths that wound up the shuddering peaks. Willem rose, his eyes set on the ascent ahead, a renewed determination in his gaze. He began to climb, his hands steady as he drove pitons into the ice, each one a lifeline securing his path, a bond forged between the living and the dead. With the spirits at his side, Willem moved with purpose. They whispered of shortcuts, safer routes hidden from those without their sight. They showed him the way, and Willem followed, his movements careful, deliberate. The journey was still perilous, but he felt a sense of camaraderie with the souls that accompanied him. Together they ascended, the wind howling around them, the peaks looming ever higher. A challenge he was ready to face, one step at a time. Maxime Morai and Nazareth reached the room where Nazareth had once recovered the magic scroll he still kept with him. The room was unchanged since his last visit. Yet now, a gruesome sight greeted them. What appeared to be another unfortunate rogue, wrapped from head to toe by a monstrous manifestation that masqueraded as a scroll, the body hanging suspended from the ceiling like a macabre trophy. Nazareth's lips curled in disdain. The foul thing hath managed to actually claim a victim, it seemeth, he muttered, his eyes narrowing at the foolish corpse. Maxim gave a mirthless chuckle, his gaze fixed on the dangling corpse. "Aye, and so the cycle repeateth." With a casual wave of his hand, Maxim summoned a zombie archer from the shadows. "Loose an arrow, bring it down," he commanded, his voice cold, indifferent. The archer obeyed, releasing an arrow that struck true, severing the manifestation's hold. The body thudded to the ground, lifeless. Without hesitation, Maxim summoned more undead from the shadows, their forms lurching forward to hack away at the writhing manifestation, their blows relentless until the creature stilled. Maxim stepped closer, his eyes glinting as he knelt beside the rogue's remains. With dark energy swirling around him, he resurrected the fallen rogue, adding yet another thrall to his ever-growing collection. Nazareth watched, his expression betraying a hint of disgust. "Thy magic reeketh of death, Mori," he said, his tone laced with disdain. "We have no time to tarry. The path lieth yonder." He pointed towards the direction he believed would take them deeper into the tunnels. Maxim stood, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. "Lead on then. Mayhap thou wilt find something more to thy liking." He gestured mockingly, allowing Nazareth to take the lead. They pressed on until they reached a fork in the corridor. One path bore the clear signs of a rogue party's recent passage, footprints in the dust, disturbed stones, while the other appeared untouched, a dark, untraveled route that Nazareth eyed with interest. "This way," Nazareth said, nodding towards the untraveled path. "The rogues hath chosen the obvious route, but this path may yield more fruit." Maxim looked from one path to the other, his brow arching as he noticed a tripped booby trap, its mechanisms exposed and a pitfall opened, leading into a seemingly endless abyss below. He smirked, turning to Nazareth. "Shadows seem to invite the bold. Dost thou agree?" Without waiting for an answer, Maxim stepped off the edge, disappearing into the darkness below. Nazareth's eyes widened, his hand instinctively reaching out. But before he could react further, Maxim reappeared, descending gracefully from a pocket of shadow on the other side of the pit. He turned, his expression one of amusement as he looked back at Nazareth. "Come, dost thou not trust the shadows?" Nazareth grunted, his expression hardening. "Thy antics grow tiresome, Mori," he said, though he showed no hesitation as he stepped into the shadows, emerging beside Maxim moments later. "Let us proceed." The two began their journey through the shadowed paths, moving in near silence save for the occasional command from Maxim to his undead thralls, who were sent ahead to trigger traps and clear the way. Nazareth's eyes were sharp, his instincts guiding them as they navigated the winding passages. His fate-bending prescience led them to several hidden chambers, each containing treasures, gems and trinkets long forgotten. Maxim watched with a detached interest as Nazareth collected the spoils, his own attention more focused on the dark magic that lingered in the air. "Thy greed is insatiable," Maxim remarked, his tone mocking as he watched Nazareth pocket a particularly large gemstone. Nazareth shot him a cold glare. "And thy fascination with death is no less concerning. Speak not of greed, sorcerer, when thou art driven by far darker desires." They continued onward until they came upon a darkened chamber, the air thick with the scent of decay. Before them, a rogue party was engaged in battle with half-invisible parasitic creatures, the manifestations lashing out with ethereal limbs. Maxim and Nazareth remained in the shadows, watching as the rogues fought for their lives. They struggle. Maxim observed, his voice barely a whisper. Yet they endure. Nazareth's gaze was unyielding, his eyes fixed on the battle. For now, he said, his tone indifferent. They watched as the rogue party managed to defeat the creatures, though not without casualties. As the survivors moved on, Maxim stepped forward, his hand raised. He called forth the remains of the parasitic manifestations, his dark magic reanimating them. The creatures merged, their forms twisting and expanding, becoming more whole. Nazareth turned away, his expression one of disgust. "Thy magic is an affront to the natural order," he muttered, continuing down the path. Maxim merely smiled, following after him, his newly raised thralls trailing behind. The tunnels grew more labyrinthine, the passages winding and twisting in seemingly endless loops. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, an ominous growl echoed through the tunnels, a sound that seemed to resonate from all directions at once. Maxim and Nazareth exchanged a glance, their eyes narrowing as they became aware of the illusion, each seeing a clone of the other standing at opposite ends of the room, the illusion designed to lead them astray. The clones sneered, their laughter echoing through the chamber before they faded away. The magic dispelled by Maxim's intuition and Nazareth's indomitable will. Maxim stepped back to Nazareth's side, emerging from the shadows with a grim expression. A clever trick, but not clever enough. Nazareth nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness. There is something here, lurking behind these walls, a presence that followeth us still. He looked at Maxim, his gaze piercing. We shall continue, as though we know it not. Maxim's smile returned, a dark glint in his eyes. As thou wishest, though I would have thee know, the thralls I left behind hath been slaughtered one by one. We are not alone, Lord Nazareth. Nazareth's jaw tightened, his resolve unshaken. Let them come, then. We shall see who surviveth this darkness. The two continued onward, their steps careful, their senses heightened as they ventured deeper into the unknown, their bond forged by necessity, their path fraught with peril. Zinhera drifted through a surreal and tempestuous dreamscape, her steps guided by the pulses of lightning and flows of spiritual energy that twisted around her. The air shimmered in hues of electric blue and deep violet, and the ground beneath her seemed to ripple like water, each step releasing a faint melodic hum. The scent of ozone hung thick in the air, and distant echoing rumbles of thunder provided a haunting accompaniment to her journey. She moved with intent, yet hesitation tinged her every stride. The very fabric of this place was her psyche, and the storm roiling above mirrored her inner turmoil. The path before her was treacherous, shifting constantly, as though every step she took betrayed her uncertainty. Lightning clashed and raged, crackling along the edges of spectral obstacles. Metaphors of her struggles, symbols of her dependency on Ayanga, her elemental guardian. She remembered the time Ayanga's power had saved her from certain death, shielding her from an enemy's deadly strike. Yet she also recalled how that same reliance had once left her paralyzed with doubt, unable to act without Ayanga's presence. These memories weighed heavily on her, reminding her of the duality that defined their bond. It was a dichotomy she could not ignore. Ayanga, with all her power, had been both the strength upon which she leaned and the chain she could not break. Ayanga, thou art never far, Zinhera whispered to herself, her eyes narrowing against the luminous flashes of energy. She could feel Ayanga's presence, a subdued warmth within the storms, and it both comforted and pained her. She knew Ayanga would never wish for complacency, not while an old enemy prowled the master plane. Her elemental guardian was a warrior, a force that would never allow herself to be dormant during such times. And yet, here she was, under a sleep not of her choosing. And Zinhera found herself lost, without the very anchor that had been the root of her identity for so long. The obstacles, each more ethereal than the last, were illusions forged by her deepest insecurities. Her fear of being powerless without Ayanga, and her lingering doubt about whether she could ever be truly independent. A shifting bridge, resembling her face, split in its identity, above a chasm of pure void, beckoned her to cross. Countless disembodied arms reached and grasped in an attempt to ensnare her legs. Mirrors lining her peripheral vision reflected a self in the form of a mass of fractured shards. Yet Zinhera pressed forward, her will undeterred. She knew Ayanga needed her just as she needed Ayanga. The two were halves, never whole without one another, despite Zinhera's yearning for independence. She moved through the challenges, sometimes stumbling, sometimes wincing, but always moving forward, driven by an unwavering determination that defined her. Eventually, she came upon Ayanga, lying at rest within a pool of luminous waters, the form of her guardian motionless beneath an unnatural slumber. Zinhera approached, feeling the quiet weight of the moment, her gaze hardening. Her hands trembled as she reached down, touching Ayanga's forehead gently. "Awaken, my dearest ally," she murmured, her voice filled with both reverence and demand, the kind of strength born from countless battles shared. A warrior as thou art should not linger in a dream, not whilst enemies, unseen, dare encroach upon our world. A silence fell, stretching painfully. For a heartbeat, Zinhera feared that Ayanga would not stir. But she focused, closed her eyes, and channeled all that she had. The strength born of the years they had spent together, the understanding of Ayanga's spirit, her desires, her rage, her passion. Slowly, Ayanga's eyes opened, the light within them flickering to life once more, and the waters around her rippled with newfound energy. Ayanga rose, their unity returning as lightning surged from the Guardian into Zinhera's being. Ayanga's eyes, sharp and full of intensity, locked onto Zinhera's. Her voice came forth, deep and resonant, filled with a touch of scorn. "I hath tarried far too long, and thou dare to awaken me with soft whispers. Knowest thou not, Zinhera, that I shall awaken only when the storm itself trembles?" Zinhera smiled faintly, her lips curving with both affection and exasperation. "Aye, thou art ever prideful, Ayanga. I dared not bring the storm lest it consume thee, and in turn myself." Ayanga huffed, her form shimmering with a renewed vigor as she rose fully, water cascading off her form. "Thou thinkest thyself capable of shielding me from my own storm?" She eyed Zinhera critically, before a smirk tugged at her lips. Perhaps thou hast grown more than I thought, little one. Zinhera chuckled softly, her voice laced with warmth, yet there was a steely resolve beneath it. We have enemies upon the master plane, old foes who dare move in our absence. I would not face them without thee by my side. Ayanga nodded, her expression darkening at the thought of old adversaries. Together, then, we shall remind them why they once feared us. Outside the dreamscape, Eden watched the steady drip of the serum being administered to Zinhera's mouth, her heart pounding with every drop. What if this failed? The thought gnawed at her, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She could not bear the idea of losing Zinhera, not after everything they had been through. She had waited for the right time, the second hour precisely, as the instructions had dictated. But as the minutes crawled by, a creeping fear gripped her. Nothing seemed to happen, and doubt clouded her thoughts. Was Zinhera's brew a failure? Had the enchantments been too weak to breach the barrier of Zinhera's self-imposed coma? Frustration mounting, Eden turned to her emergency preparations, her fingers working deftly to formulate an alternate potion, anything that might bring Zinhera back. Her heart thundered in her chest, anxiety gnawing at her resolve. She would not lose her. Not now, not like this. Suddenly, a ferocious surge of power erupted from Zinhera's body. An explosion of lightning that arced and tore through the surrounding space. The blinding flashes illuminated the area, casting harsh shadows, as the force of the energy sent shockwaves rippling outward, cracking stone and splitting the earth beneath her. The sheer brightness was almost unbearable, and the air vibrated with an electric intensity that seemed to shake the entire structure. A corona of energy crackled from her, incinerating every ounce of nearby debris. Eden barely had time to react, her instincts freezing her in place as the destruction closed in. "Out of harm's way thou shalt go," shouted Samuel Andrews, his voice resolute as his chains snaked through the air, wrapping around Eden's waist. He yanked her away just in time, the two collapsing to the ground in a flurry of dust as deadly debris smashed where Eden had stood only moments earlier. Zinhera rose, her eyes snapping open, the irises aglow, radiant and crackling with the vibrant, untamed energy of lightning. Her lips curled into a slight, confident smile as Ayanga gradually rose into control. Her posture was resolute, shoulders squared and head held high, as though shedding the remnants of sleep from herself. Zinhera was whole again, Ayanga's presence flowing in harmony within her. Their bond restored, the lightning that danced in her gaze signified that Zinhera was no longer lost. She was herself once more, complete and unyielding. Ayanga's voice echoed softly within Zinhera's mind. "Let us move, Zinhera. The storm calls and we must answer." Zinhera nodded, determination etched across her face. "Aye, my friend. Together we shall meet whatever comes." Willemtot continued his steady ascent up the shuddering peaks, each step deliberate, guided by the souls of the dead adventurers who had fallen prey to this treacherous path. The harsh terrain stretched before him, jagged rocks coated in ice, the biting cold seeping through his clothing, and the relentless wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. Each breath came out as a puff of mist, and the snow beneath his boots crunched with an unforgiving chill. His movements were careful, his eyes ever watchful, and his years of experience evident in how he read the landscape. The souls spoke to him, whispering their stories of lives lived before the mountains claimed them. One spirit, a young rogue named Elira, recounted her final climb, how she had pushed onward despite the worsening storm, her thoughts only on reaching the summit. She spoke of the moment her footing gave way, the blinding snow swallowing her screams as she fell. Her last thoughts filled with regret for the family she had left behind. Willem listened with a solemn heart, taking in the moments that led them to their deaths. The brutal cold, the blinding snow, the unforgiving winds that stripped hope from their very souls. He offered each spirit his respect, allowing their voices to linger as they recounted their final moments. As he climbed, Willem found solace in reuniting these souls with their remains. He would uncover their bones, scattered by the merciless elements, and guide the spirits back to their resting place, one by one. "Rest now, friend," he murmured as another spirit faded from his sight, the chill of their departure leaving a cold yet peaceful void. It was his way of honoring the fallen, of giving them a closure that the unforgiving peaks had denied them. He ascended a little further, his breath steady, until something unusual caught his eye. Remains of dead rogues littered his path, but these were different, mangled, gear torn apart, the bodies twisted in unnatural ways. There were signs of something monstrous, something that had not just claimed their lives but ravaged their bodies. Willem knelt by one of the corpses, examining the singed metal and dried-out bones. He noted the twisted, almost crushed state of the gear. These were not the actions of mere scavengers. The ferocity of the damage, the way the bodies were left in disarray, this was the work of something malicious, something that devoured the dead entirely. Willem's expression hardened, a chill settling into his bones that had nothing to do with the cold. This was no simple accident, he muttered to himself, a grim determination setting in as the truth of the danger became clear. He felt both a sense of dread and a rising resolve. Whatever monstrous presence had done this, he would avoid it. The weather began to turn, the wind howling louder, the temperature dropping with each passing minute. The snow thickened, and Willem knew it was time to pause. He found a small cave not far from his current position. Shelter from the elements. He moved inside, dropping his pack to the ground and letting out a breath. "The peaks are retaliating to our progress," he whispered, glancing at the cave entrance he anticipated would be nearby. "Time to rest." As Willem settled in, he could feel the effects of the alchemized food taking hold. The warmth spread from his core, his body resisting the biting cold that sought to sap his strength. The mixture provided not only nourishment, but a steady infusion of heat, his muscles relaxing and his energy slowly returning. The subtle, invigorating magic of the alchemical cuisine allowed his senses to stay sharp despite the exhaustion, and the chill that usually burrowed deep into his bones seemed to fade, replaced by a comforting warmth that warded off fatigue. He could endure even in these dire conditions. With practiced precision, Willem set up a temporary camp. He gathered his tools and began preparing more food. His hands moved deftly, combining the right ingredients, his mind focused as he worked. The scent of the meal began to fill the cave, and the warmth of the alchemical mixture slowly infused the space, warding off the chill. He allowed himself a moment of respite, leaning back against the rough cave wall. The spirits had fallen silent for now, and Willem embraced the quiet, preparing himself for what lay ahead. He knew the journey up the shuddering peaks was far from over, and whatever monstrous presence lurked in the higher reaches, he would be ready. Samuel Andrews moved with a deliberate limp, guiding Eden toward the rear end of the House of Tiny Lies' outer gates. His demeanor remained calm, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings for signs of trouble. Eden trailed closely behind, her enhanced draconic senses already at work, her eyes flickering as she closed her focus on the guards stationed around the guild house. The air was heavy, full of tension, as the two did some reconnaissance around the guards. "Keep thine ears open, Eden," Samuel murmured under his breath, positioning himself as a lookout, his back pressed against the cold stone of the nearby wall. "I will make sure no unwanted gaze falls upon thee." Eden offered a slight nod, her eyes narrowing as she focused, her hearing honing in on the hushed conversation between the guards. Her draconic senses heightened her awareness, her ears twitching slightly, as she caught every subtle sound, her posture straightening, as if instinctively attuning herself to the surrounding energies. Whispers traveled through the air, concerns surrounding the loss of influence over the settlement's people. The words "unwriting" were repeated, the term hanging in the air like a bitter memory. They spoke of lost contacts, fading control, and uncertainty that made their voices waver. The unwriting had changed their world, leaving the House of Tiny Lies struggling to maintain its once ironclad grip. Suddenly, Samuel's gaze sharpened, catching a flicker of movement from the loft window, a guard's shadow shifting unnaturally against the dim light. "Eden," he whispered, the urgency clear in his voice. She glanced up just as his eyes flicked to the loft window. A guard had spotted them, his face half shrouded in shadow, and the shout that followed set everything into motion. "We hath been seen," Samuel growled, tossing aside his crutches without hesitation. Though his body bore the weight of his injuries, his spirit remained unbroken, and he stood tall, his eyes blazing with latent fearlessness. "If they want another bout, I shall give it them gladly." Eden grabbed his arm, her eyes sharp and determined. "Hold, Samuel. A fight now might well mean our demise." But it was too late. The guards had already begun their approach, weapons at the ready. Samuel met their advance with a fearless grin. "Come, cowards, I still stand," he shouted, his chains ready to whip out at the approaching guard patrol. Eden stepped forward, her presence rapturing their attention. She raised her hands, her movements deliberate and confident. "Peace, I pray thee, good men," she called out, her blindfolded face giving her an aura of mystique and authority. Each guard gazed with muted captivation as her voice slipped into a gentler tone. "Hearken unto me. I see the uncertainty within thee. Thy guild, the House of Tiny Lies, hath lost its way. Its influence over the settlement is waning, and the world hath changed after the unwriting. I offer thee a different path, a path with the golden bough, a fairer way for all." The guards hesitated, their eyes flicking between Eden and Samuel, who stood ready to fight. They were torn, their loyalty to the guild wavering in the face of her sincerity. Eden pressed on, stepping closer, her voice almost a whisper. "Thy leaders care not for thee, nor for the people of this settlement. They have left thee to fend for yourselves, ignoring thy pleas for aid while they squander resources and cling to their fading power. They cling to their power even as it fades. Join us, and I shall ensure thee a place of security, a position with honor among the Golden Bow's guards, better conditions, fairer wages, a purpose worth fighting for." One of the guards swallowed hard, his stance loosening. He eyed his comrades before speaking. "And what if thou speak false, lady?" The guard frowned, glancing skeptically at his comrades for reassurance, his fingers tightening nervously around the hilt of his weapon. Eden smiled, her eyes warm, yet piercing. "I offer thee coin now, as a token of my sincerity," she said, holding up a small pouch, "and a promise of a better tomorrow. Will thou take it?" After a tense moment, the guards nodded slowly. Eden smiled, and Samuel let out a deep breath. "Then let us away from here. There is much to discuss." As they returned to the Golden Bow, the tension began to ease. Eden led the guards to their quarters, offering them rest and time to acclimate to their new allegiances. Once they were settled, she and Samuel moved to a quieter part of the house to discuss the new information. They spoke freely. Eden began, her voice low. She paused, her gaze distant for a moment as she considered the gravity of what she was about to share. The House of Tiny Lies is losing its influence rapidly. The rogues that serve them grow weary, ready to rise up against their leaders. And the leaders, in turn, grow desperate, sending rogues to the shuddering peaks to acquire some rumored power. Samuel frowned, his eyes narrowing in skepticism. "A power? What kind of power, thinkst thou?" "They did not know for certain," Eden replied, "but they believe it real. They paid dearly for capable rogues to make the climb." She paused, a shadow crossing her expression. One of the guards mentioned a man, a large demonic figure, sent at their request. Samuel exchanged a glance with Eden, his expression darkening. "Darren Loneswift," he muttered. "That description fits him." Eden nodded. "Aye, and he is said to be at the Shuddering Peaks. We have a lead now." She hesitated, glancing at Samuel. "But thou art still recovering, Samuel. The Shuddering Peaks are dangerous. And if Darren is there..." "I care not for the danger," Samuel interrupted, his voice resolute. "If Darren Loneswift is there, I must go. I shall meet Willem, and together we will deal with the Jinn, and with Darren, if need be." Eden frowned, her worry clear in her eyes. "Thou art being reckless. Thy body is yet healing. Facing the Shuddering Peaks and the Jinn is madness." Before Samuel could respond, a new voice joined them. "Worry not, Eden," Zinhera said as she approached. "I have a plan." Eden and Samuel turned to her, hope flickering in their eyes. "What dost thou propose?" Eden asked. Zinhera smiled, her eyes crackling with determination. "One that shall see us through, with the storm as our ally, not our foe." Oiji was deep in his artificing operations, the rhythmic hum of machinery, and the glow of arcane energy surrounding him. His workspace was cluttered with tools and materials. Half-finished inventions lay scattered across workbenches, and shelves brimmed with ancient tomes, each page brimming with arcane knowledge. The air was thick with the scent of molten metal and magical residue. Suddenly, a knocking on his door interrupted his work. He frowned, setting down a delicate component, and made his way to the entrance. Opening the door, he found Zinhera and Samuel standing before him, their expressions urgent. "Oiji," Zinhera began, her eyes alight with determination. "We need your help." Oiji raised an eyebrow, stepping aside to let them enter. "What manner of trouble has brought thee to my doorstep?" Zinhera wasted no time in explaining her plan. "The Jinn," she said, her voice steady. "We intend to capture it. I have researched a method involving magical runes and a vial, a way to subdue and trap it. All of my research on elemental runes used for trapping Jinn is at your disposal." She handed Oiji a collection of parchments and a small vial, intricately inscribed with symbols. Samuel, standing beside her, nodded. "With your expertise, we believe you can craft enchanted manacles using the provided runic alphabet and vial that could help us subdue and contain the Jinn with Willem and my assistance." Oiji examined the parchments, his eyes skimming over the runic symbols, his mind already analyzing the details. At first, his expression was one of skepticism, a faint frown creasing his brow. He muttered under his breath, clearly questioning some of the rune's validity. But as he continued, intrigue slowly replaced the skepticism. There was potential here, even if flawed. He hummed thoughtfully, his gaze flicking up to meet Zinhera's. "Thou dost believe it to be so simple?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "There are flaws in thy understanding, errors in the application of these runes. But..." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he reconsidered the information. "Thy concept is not entirely wrong. It is possible." Zinhera's eyes brightened, and Oiji allowed himself a small smile. He pondered her proposition further, his mind whirling with possibilities. How the Jinn's power could amplify his own work, how integrating its essence could push the boundaries of what was thought possible in the arcane arts. He considered the risks, the potential for failure, but also the rewards, new insights into the metaphysical changes wrought by the unwriting, and perhaps a way to harness them for greater control over reality itself. A Jinn, a true Jinn, would be a rare specimen, the perfect magic catalyst he needed to bolster his experiments on bending the artist's magic to his will. Yes, this could work. The potential for new breakthroughs was too great to ignore. "Very well," Oiji finally said, his voice resolute. "I shall assist thee. But know this, such work requires precision beyond mere enchantment. We are dealing with an entity that may surpass even the limitations of the runes thou hast provided." Without wasting another moment, Oiji led them to his arcane forge, currently brimming with half-finished inventions and scattered tools with odd glows. The air was thick with the metallic tang of heated metal, and the acrid scent of magical residue lingered heavily. Flickering runes cast an eerie light, illuminating the countless shelves of glowing crystals, jars of mysterious substances, and tools, each humming with a faint arcane energy. The ambient sound was a mix of low hums, the occasional crackle of magic, and the rhythmic clanking of arcane machinery. He brought Zinhera's studies to his workbench and began the process of crafting the enchanted manacles. The runes were etched onto the manacles, and the vial was integrated into the design, a conduit meant to contain the djinn's essence. But as Oiji focused his arcane power into the manacles, something went wrong. A burst of dark energy erupted from the forge, an ominous roar echoing through the chamber as the temperature plummeted. The dark energy swirled violently, crackling like 1,000 whispers, its form a chaotic blend of shadows and sickly green light. The specter that emerged was twisted and unnatural, its presence chilling the very air around them, a hollow wail filling the room as it lunged forward. It lunged towards Zinhera, its spectral claws reaching for her. Without hesitation, Zinhera raised her hand, lightning crackling around her fingers, and blasted the specter with a bolt of pure energy, reducing it to nothingness in an instant. Oiji scowled, brushing soot from his robes. "That should not have happened," he muttered, picking up one of Zinhera's tomes and flipping through the pages. He squinted at the runes, realization dawning upon him. "The information thou hast provided, while not incorrect, no longer applies to our reality as it stands. The unwriting event altered our metaphysical laws, and what once held true no longer does." He glanced at Zinhera, his eyes sharp. "This entity thou callest a djinn. It is not what thou thinkst. It is not bound by the rules familiar to thee." Zinhera looked perplexed, but Oiji's mind was already racing, the pieces clicking into place. With newfound insight, Oiji proposed a different approach, a new plan to trap this mysterious entity. Unlike the original plan that relied solely on elemental runes and containment through a vial, Oiji's revised strategy involved directly nullifying the entity's magical abilities. Instead of manacles, he designed a head-clamping contraption that would cut off the entity's capacity to possess a body, effectively sapping its magical essence and drawing it into a secure vessel. This approach was far more sophisticated, addressing the flaws in Zinhera's plan by considering the altered metaphysical properties brought about by the unwriting. He began to design a superior creation, a strange contraption that would clamp onto the entity's entire head, nullifying its magic and preventing it from possessing any host. The device would draw the entity into a vessel, sealing it away, ensuring it could do no further harm. And of course, ultimately serving its purpose as a cornerstone to a future experiment. With the hum of arcane energy and his own meticulous skill, Oiji worked tirelessly, crafting the device with precision. Hours passed, and at last, the contraption was complete. He held it up, examining the runic etchings and the intricate mechanisms that would serve to trap the entity. Unlike typical enchantments, this contraption combined multiple layers of arcane defenses, runes to disrupt magical flow, a siphoning mechanism to drain energy, and a containment field to prevent any residual magic from escaping. It was a masterful blend of artificing and enchantment, an innovation that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. A smile of satisfaction crossed his face. "Success," he said, turning to Zinhera and Samuel. "This will do what thy original plan could not. It shall sap the entity's ability to wield magic, and we shall trap it in this vessel." Zinhera nodded, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "Thank you, Oiji. With this we stand a chance." Samuel stepped forward, placing a hand on Oiji's shoulder. "Thy help means everything to us. he said sincerely. "Wilt thou join us in this task?" Oiji considered for a moment, then nodded. "Indeed, I shall. There is much to learn, and my curiosity will not allow me to sit idle. I will see this through with mine own eyes." And so it was decided. Oiji would accompany them to the Shuddering Peaks, where Willem awaited, and where Darren, possessed by the Jinn, would be dealt with once and for all. Maxime Mori and Nazareth moved cautiously through the narrow passage, the dim light casting shadows across the rocky walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay as they came upon the eviscerated remains of several rogue party members. Maxime knelt down, placing his hand on one of the bodies, his eyes narrowing as he focused. Slowly, a faint greenish glow surrounded his fingertips, and the bodies began to stir. He could feel the resistance from the spirits, an almost tangible reluctance, like a cold weight pushing against his power. The energy coursing through his veins was both exhilarating and chilling, a reminder of the delicate line he walked between life and death. His senses heightened, the whispers of the dead echoing faintly in his mind as he forced their obedience. The dead rogues rose, their hollow eyes locking onto Maxime as he whispered to them. "What hath ended thee?" Maxime asked, his voice carrying a cold detachment. The undead rogues blinked, their spectral voices echoing hollowly. "We know not," one of them rasped, their expression twisting in confusion. "It came from nowhere, sudden, relentless." Nazareth watched, his jaw clenched, as Maxim attempted to glean more information from the revived spirits. Suddenly, a shout pierced the silence, and a rogue who had been hiding in the shadows lunged out, his face twisted in panic. His eyes were wide with terror, his gaunt frame trembling as he charged forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as if every ounce of his being was consumed by fear. He charged towards Maxim, but the sorcerer disappeared into a shadowy mist, and in his place, 3 undead rogues lunged forward. They tore into the panicked rogue, their hands clawing and mouths biting, devouring him in gruesome, grotesque fashion. Nazareth's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his instincts screaming danger. Just then, he caught a flicker of movement. With a snarl, Nazareth lunged forward, shoving Maxim out of the way as a scythe-like blade slashed through the air, missing Maxim's head by mere inches. The blade-wielding assailant landed heavily on the stone floor, its hulking form shifting in the dim light, a large, monstrous figure covered in bladed appendages. Nazareth snarled, his muscles tensing as he faced the beast. It was almost larger than he was, its eyes glinting with malice. The creature moved swiftly, its bladed arms swinging towards Nazareth. One blade struck his torso, but his leviathan scales manifested just in time, rippling across his skin like a wave of dark metal, absorbing the impact with an almost metallic clang. Nazareth felt the scales harden, a comforting pressure that shielded his flesh from harm. The sensation akin to armor snapping into place, bringing with it a surge of confidence. The other blade he caught with his bare hand, his grip ironclad as the blade barely broke his skin. Face to face with the otherworldly enemy, Nazareth let out a deep growl. The creature, undeterred, lifted Nazareth off his feet and swung him towards the edge of the narrow ledge, hurling him into the depths below. But Nazareth vanished into the shadows, reappearing beside Maxim with a determined scowl. Behind them, a parade of undead rogues, resurrected by Maxim along their travels, began charging towards the entity. The creature snarled, reaching into a satchel on its belt and pulling out a small object. With a flick of its wrist, it hurled the object to the ground, and a burst of sweet-smelling acidic goo exploded outward, coating the undead rogues and trapping them in place. The entity moved with frightening precision, firing a projectile from its shoulder that struck a lofty contraption above them. In an instant, several revolving guillotine blades activated, slicing across the bridge they were on. Maxim moved in tandem with Nazareth, who evaded the whirling blades that came within a hair of striking them and obliterating the blades that would kill Maxim with well-timed, precise blows. The collapsing bridge forced them back, retreating into the rooms from which they had come. Maxim grabbed Nazareth's arm, and the two descended into the shadows, reappearing in what they thought to be the safest part of the previous room. Instead, they found themselves standing on crumbling ground, surrounded by a hive of skulkers, each one spewing acid and snapping its jaws hungrily as the mysterious hulking assailant watched from above. Nazareth's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening as he assessed their situation. Before the creatures could lunge at them, Nazareth shook his head, snapping back to reality. It was a premonition, a vision of what would have happened had he accepted Maxim's shadow transport. With a growl, Nazareth grabbed Maxim and lunged towards the wall, using brute force to barrel through it, creating a hidden path forward. The hulking assailant pursued them like a relentless predator, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air, using its heightened senses to track their scent. Its eyes glowed faintly as it scanned the darkness, and its movements were calculated, each step deliberate, as it activated various archaic gadgetry. Small clicks and hums emanating from its armor as it adjusted its weaponry. It stalked them into the new entryway, every motion precise, like a hunter closing in on its prey. However, upon crossing the threshold, it found itself in an entirely new environment. A wide-open coliseum, shimmering with an eerie blue light. Maxim and Nazareth were nowhere in sight, leaving the creature momentarily disoriented. A horde of undead suddenly appeared from shadowy vortexes, clawing at the creature's appendages, scratching and biting, though it managed to pull away, retreating back into the corridor. But as the creature turned, it found itself standing at the mouth of yet another coliseum, an identical arena bathed in that unsettling blue glow. It was lost, unable to navigate the shifting surroundings, its confidence shaken. It grappled desperately with its gadgetry, firing a hook towards a pillar only to realize it was an illusion. The creature was yanked straight into Nazareth's waiting grip. Nazareth grinned, his eyes wild with excitement, as his massive hands clamped down on the creature's ribs. He twisted, a sickening crunch echoing through the arena as the creature let out a strangled cry, blood splattering across Nazareth's face. With a triumphant roar, Nazareth spun, heaving the beast into a nearby wall. The creature staggered to its feet, its movements frantic. It scurried towards the shadows, only to be met by Nazareth at every turn, his massive form seemingly appearing from nowhere. The beast, growing desperate, activated a device on its belt, a strange, high-pitched alarm filling the air. Nazareth tensed, recognizing the sound. "Skulker," he hissed, his eyes scanning the ceiling. He turned to warn Maxim, but the sorcerer remained unnervingly calm. The darkness of the room seemed to shift as Maxim revealed his own zombified skulker, a massive creature whose tentacles shot out, ensnaring the assailant. Acid dripped from the creature's tentacles, sizzling against the enemy's flesh as it was dragged into the shadows. Before disappearing entirely, one of Maxim's undead retrieved the creature's belongings. A map, strange weaponry, and peculiar gadgets. Maxim studied the map, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "Let us see what secrets thou hast kept," he murmured. The map led them deeper into the labyrinth, to a hidden chamber containing a peculiar statue. The statue's most notable feature was its large, gaping mouth, carved with intricate details. As they approached, the statue's mouth began to move, a hollow voice echoing from within. "Great is the weapon that cuts on its own," it intoned, its voice hollow and echoing with an eerie authority. Far below, life-laden shadows pulse to the unrelenting rhythm of a beating heart. A sacrifice is required. Maxim waved his hand, commanding several of his undead to step forward. They walked into the statue's gaping maw, their blank eyes devoid of fear. The jaws snapped shut, and the sound of bones crunching echoed through the chamber, followed by a grotesque, squelching noise. The undead's faces twisted momentarily in pain before their forms went limp, crushed beyond recognition, as blood and ichor seeped from the statue's mouth. Moments later, the statue shifted, revealing a hidden reservoir filled with a dark, viscous liquid. "Black water," Maxim whispered, his eyes narrowing as the statue began to recite a cryptic poem, hinting at the dark properties of the substance, how it could corrupt those who consumed it, turning them into dark-hearted beings. Maxim and Nazareth peered into the reservoir, their reflections staring back, twisted, darker versions of themselves. A distant rumble echoed through the chamber, the sound of tunnels and chambers shifting and flooding with the black water. Nazareth's eyes met Maxim's, a silent understanding passing between them. And though neither spoke, the resolve in their gazes conveyed everything. Willem Toth stood amidst the whirling snow, the blizzard's relentless fury biting at his exposed skin, each gust of wind howling like a beast. His instincts flared. Someone, or something, was approaching. He straightened, squinting into the raging white, hand hovering near one of his spirit vessels. Then he saw it, a glowing blue aura cutting through the storm. He narrowed his eyes until the figures emerged, revealing Zinhera, Samuel, and Oiji. Zinhera led the way, her magic illuminating their path, the shimmering blue radiance stark against the gray of the storm. Samuel trudged beside her, his powerful frame pushing against the gusts, his face set with stubborn determination. He muttered a curse under his breath, his voice almost lost to the storm, a reflection of his defiant will. Oiji, on the other hand, looked thoroughly displeased, his face twisted in annoyance. He had wrapped himself tightly against the elements, muttering about how such conditions were unfit for the likes of a mind such as his. Willem allowed a small smile as they drew closer. They had found his climbing pitons, and had managed to navigate the treacherous terrain to reach him, though their struggle was evident. The exhaustion was etched in their faces, but the drive in their eyes was undiminished. "Thou hast found me," Willem called out, his voice barely audible above the howling storm. "Come, there is warmth here." Zinhera nodded, her breath coming in visible puffs. "We have followed thy path, Willem. 'Twas no easy feat," she admitted, glancing back at Samuel and Oiji. Samuel snorted, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Nay, 'twas like fighting a damned beast every step of the way," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Indeed," Oiji added, rubbing his hands together. "I pray thou hast warmth to spare. The shuddering peaks are no place for civilized men." Willem gestured for them to follow, leading them to the small shelter he had managed to carve out from the harsh landscape. A flickering fire lay at its center, small yet steady, casting a dim but welcoming glow that danced upon the stone walls. The heat from the flames reached out, wrapping them in a comforting embrace as they settled around it. "Rest thyselves," Willem said, rummaging through his supplies. He retrieved some of his alchemically enhanced rations and handed them out. "The journey hath been long, and the cold is relentless. Partake in this, and let it ease thy weariness." They all ate, the warmth of the fire and food gradually pushing away the biting chill of the storm. As they did, Zinhera wasted no time explaining why they had come. "We have need of thee, Willem," she began, her voice steady. "We intend to capture the Jinn. Thy power, thy connection to the spirits, 'tis needed. Thou couldst speak with Darren, or the Jinn itself, act as a mediator whilst we act." Willem chuckled softly, shaking his head. "An exorcist thou dost think me? Nay, I am more akin to a speaker for the voiceless, an orator. My strength lies in understanding, not banishment." Oiji nodded, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "People are ever eager to thrust upon us titles that suit their needs, rather than truth," he said, leaning back, his eyes fixed on Willem. "As for me, I shall remind thee all once more. I shall not be partaking in combat against a Jinn. I am here to observe and assist, not to contend with spirits. This plan, thou art sure thou hast it fully under control?" Zinhera's expression shifted, her eyes flashing as streaks of white shot through her hair. Ayanga's voice emerged, calm yet commanding. "The plan remaineth unchanged. I shall face the Jinn in battle. Samuel shall lend his strength, and when the moment is right, we shall employ thy contraption, Oiji." Samuel gave a firm nod, his eyes fierce with determination. I shall stand beside thee, Zinhera, or Ayanga. Jinn, or no Jinn, I am ready." Willem watched them, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly. "Very well," he said, his voice softer. "If Darren remains within, trapped, I shall try to reach him, or at the least I shall reason with the Jinn. But know this, I make no promises. The spirits, they are fickle, and the Jinn more so." The group settled in for the night, hoping the storm would relent. But by the time they stirred again, it was clear the weather had no intention of calming. Zinhera tried once more to call upon Ayanga's lightning to clear a path. But the storm was impervious, a force of wind and snow beyond her control. Willem's culinary magic, however, kept their bodies warm, the enhanced food fighting the effects of the frigid cold. They pressed onward, relying on Willem's knowledge of the mountain to guide them through the harsh landscape. They had barely covered much ground when a new threat emerged. A monstrous figure loomed ahead, its many legs shifting unnaturally, disfigured human features contorting as it let out a guttural hiss. It was massive, immovable against the blizzard, its venomous mandibles glistening even in the dim light. The battle that followed was chaotic and fierce. Samuel and Zinera, under Ayanga's control, charged ahead, their movements synchronized, while Willem and Oiji stayed back, keeping clear of the immediate danger. Samuel fought with reckless abandon, his chain whip slashing through the air, striking the creature's limbs with precision. The creature recoiled with each blow, its many legs twitching violently as it let out guttural hisses of pain. Ayanga channeled her power through Zinera, lightning crackling across the battlefield, her strikes calculated and powerful, causing the creature to stagger and thrash in retaliation. The creature retaliated with swift, venomous attacks, its many legs making it difficult to predict its movements. But Samuel's brute strength and Ayanga's agility kept them in control of the fight. After an intense struggle, the creature was finally brought down, its massive form collapsing into the snow. Willem approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the monstrous corpse. Something caught his attention, an icy sack on the creature's back. He moved closer, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he might find. Entangled in the creature's venomous webbing was the body of a rogue, long since perished. Willem's eyes softened as a spirit emerged, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Thank thee," the spirit whispered. "I have enjoyed this journey, and though I have nothing to offer, I would stay, if thou wilt have me." Willem nodded, holding up one of his 4 pointed star soul gems. "Then stay with me," he said quietly, allowing the spirit to merge with the gem. He felt the spirit's warmth settle within, a steady presence that offered silent companionship. With the creature defeated and the spirit at peace, the group pressed on, their eyes set on the distant structure that awaited them through the unyielding blizzard. They moved closer, the cold gnawing at them, their breaths ragged from the relentless storm. As they approached the structure, they spotted something, or rather someone, frozen in place. "Halt!" Willem called, narrowing his eyes. "It is a man. Darren Lone Swift," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Samuel stepped forward, his chain whip ready, his eyes locked onto the frozen figure. "Thinkst thou he be still possessed?" he asked, his muscles tensing in preparation for a possible fight. Willem moved closer, his spirit-sensitive senses flaring. He frowned, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Nay," he said slowly, "the vessel is empty. The jinn hath left him." Samuel's stance relaxed slightly, his brow furrowing. "Then he is but a man now?" "Indeed," Willem replied. Zinera stepped forward without hesitation, her eyes filled with concern. She knelt beside Darren, her hands moving expertly as she checked his pulse, examined his breathing, and inspected his extremities for frostbite. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, assessing the severity of his condition, her gaze sharp as she evaluated his vital signs and the effects of the cold. "He can be saved," she said after a moment, her voice calm and measured. "He needs warmth and rest. We must return him to the settlement." Samuel nodded, sheathing his chain whip. "I shall carry him," he said, his tone resolute. He lifted Darren onto his back, the unconscious man's weight seeming insignificant in Samuel's strong grasp. As they neared the structure, Willem felt a presence, an echo resonating within him. The artist's spirit, still in tow, emerges. This place, the artist murmured, a mix of excitement and disbelief in his voice. It seems familiar. Closer. Willem. Let me see. Willem approached cautiously, the feeling intensifying as they neared the entrance. Knowledge unbidden welled up inside him, as though it were not his own. He whispered the words, "The Moonlight Bastion." Suddenly from the entrance, a figure emerged. A large, bald, bearded rogue in a black long coat, an impossibly long sword in one hand, though it looked heavy enough for two. He moved with an unsettling, jerky gait, as if his body fought against its own will, each step a mixture of fluidity and rigidity. His eyes glowed with an unnatural purple light, a clear sign of possession. The artist's voice, frantic, echoed in Willem's mind. "He is evil. Destroy him." Willem hesitated, his instincts telling him something was amiss. Memories flashed in his mind, memories that were not his own, of the artist and this man, a shared history, camaraderie, betrayal. "Nay," Willem whispered. "There is more to this." Zinhera stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. She allowed Ayanga to take full control, white streaks shooting through her hair. Ayanga's voice, steady and commanding, rang out. "The Jinn hath found a new host." Without warning, the possessed rogue swung his sword, the ground shattering beneath him, cracks spreading like lightning as the earth itself seemed to rupture. Snow and debris were thrown into the air with a deafening crack, the ground trembling beneath them as the rogue moved with unnatural speed. The sensation of the earth breaking sent a jolt through each of them, a momentary loss of balance as the land itself seemed to shudder in response. An epic battle commenced. The rogue's strikes were lethal, his long sword cleaving through the air with terrifying precision. He wielded the dark magic of the Jinn, manipulating the blizzard around them to his advantage. Snow blindness intensified, obscuring the party members from one another, as if they were fighting both the rogue and their own isolation. Powerful gusts of wind whipped across the battlefield, pulling them off balance or slamming them into the ground. Samuel was unrelenting, his chain whip flashing through the storm, striking at the rogue and wrapping around his limbs to pull him off balance. His muscles burned from exertion, but his determination kept him fresh. His resolve unwavering, even as the cold bit into his skin and fatigue threatened to slow him. He fought with fearless tenacity, his submission techniques coming into play as he grappled with the rogue, his strength seemingly endless. No matter how many times he was struck, Samuel returned to the fight, his resolve unbroken. Ayanga, possessing Zinhera, moved with lightning speed, her attacks calculated and fierce. Bolts of raw lightning crackled from her hands, striking the rogue with precision. She dodged his sword swings, her agility keeping her just out of reach, her magic countering his attempts to control the battlefield. Willem, meanwhile, stayed clear of the direct combat, using his knowledge of the mountain to navigate the treacherous terrain. The spirits he had aided earlier returned, their ghostly forms appearing to distract the rogue, sacrificing themselves time and again to buy Willem precious moments to evade danger. He watched, his heart pounding, as Samuel and Ayanga fought, the battle seeming almost hopeless at times. Oiji, ever cautious, hung back, his sharp eyes observing the rogue's weapon. He sensed it. The sword was filled with spirits, dark souls bound within the steel. He waited, biding his time, until he saw his opportunity. Right when it mattered most, When an ally's life was in peril, Oiji stepped forward. His eyes darkened as he muttered an incantation, his hands weaving a dark curse. Skeletal wraiths manifested, grabbing hold of the rogue's blade, their bony fingers clutching the steel, burdening it with unnatural weight. The rogue struggled, but Oiji's curse upon his weapon took hold. Green flames erupted from the rogue's hands, corroding his flesh as the spirits within the blade screamed, their voices echoing like tortured wails. The rogue's arms were consumed in the green fire, his movements faltering. "Now!" Samuel shouted, his chain whip lashing out, wrapping around the rogue's neck. He pulled, binding the rogue in place. Ayanga moved in, the arcane device ready in her hands, but before she could attach it, the rogue let out a guttural laugh. He drove his own hands into his belly, gutting himself as the djinn burst forth gruesomely, burrowing out of the fresh gaping wound, escaping the human vessel before the device could trap it. The rogue collapsed, the purple glow fading from his eyes. He was alive, barely. Zinera moved quickly, her medical expertise coming to the fore as she worked to stabilize him, her hands steady and sure. Oiji approached the fallen sword, his eyes gleaming with interest. He could feel the power still within it, the spirits of 100 reptilian souls bound to the blade. "This shall make for an incredible component," he murmured, his mind already working through the possibilities for his arcane forge. As the party gathered their bearings, Willem turned and entered the Moonlight Bastion. The artist grew tight-lipped, however the knowledge flowed freely the soul gem he was bound to. Willem envisioned flashes of the artist completing large paintings of this very structure, as if he worshipped it. This structure was one of metamagic, a place of immense power, capable of shaping the very fabric of the region and bridging worlds apart. Willem's eyes widened, unable to understand how this abandoned structure could do such wondrous things. But all would be understood soon, as Willem clutched the soul gem containing the artist, ready to bleed everything the artist knows from it.